Hello friends, my name is JJ. So when I was a child, I remember watching Disney's Tailspin one innocent afternoon when suddenly the broadcast cut to this.
This station is conducting a test of the emergency broadcast system. This is only a test.
Little JJ was understandably freaked out. Everything about it was so scary. The sudden, unannounced interruption, the stark, unaesthetic graphics, the stern male voice, that horrible ear-splitting noise. Now that I'm an adult, of course, I can appreciate the degree to which these things were features and not bugs. Ominous television warning messages like this are in fact explicitly designed to grab the attention of middle-class television audiences by asserting in the most blunt possible way the stark power of authority. So, we can think of broad modern American culture as being defined by a mostly easygoing atmosphere where people are generally left to themselves and permitted to run their own lives without much bossy oversight. The trade-off is that we are all expected to be self-policing to some degree, with membership in the middle class, which is to say the broadly comfortable socioeconomic demographic that most Americans fall into, understood to be at least partially a byproduct of an individual's ability to follow the rules and behave in a responsible manner that would not cause trouble for themselves or others. Getting in trouble with the authorities, be it the cops or the government or whatever, is seen as something that only happens to the irresponsible lower classes who are presumed to lack the knowledge on how to properly self-police. But I would argue that this preoccupation with self-discipline and personal responsibility has also primed a lot of us in the middle class to be uniquely frightened by authority, especially manifestations of authority that appear before us in weird or unusual ways. And scary manifestations of authority in middle-class life, both in reality and fiction, are what we are going to be talking about today in my second video on the fascinating topic of middle-class horror in the internet age. But first, here is a message from an authority that we should all pay attention to. Today's video sponsor, Ground News. As we will soon be discussing, one of the traditional sources of authority in middle-class life is the news media, which we all rely on to tell us what matters and what doesn't. However, these days, that credibility has started to break down as the sheer number of media outlets has proliferated exponentially, fostering growing skepticism and doubt about who to trust, which is why a good news aggregator app like Ground News is so helpful. Ground News provides you with a feed of headlines curated from over 50,000 outlets from all over the world, but with the content sorted and categorized in various ways to make it easier to see through the spin and bias and figure out what is really going on. This includes an ability to quickly swipe through the different headlines that different outlets are giving to the same story, as well as an ability to observe which outlets are choosing to ignore or underreport stories that are being widely reported elsewhere. Anyway, Ground News is a wonderful free app with endless features I am still discovering to this day, so why not give it a try? If nothing else, it is a very cool widget to have in your phone. Ground News. Be informed. Clearly. So a while ago, I made an award-winning video about middle-class horror in which I discussed what it takes to cause psychological anxiety to a mostly satisfied class of people who live lives defined by high expectations of stability and material comfort. In particular, I talked a lot about how many of the internet's most successful horror artists and pranksters seem to be especially good at taking some very ordinary and predictable artifact of middle-class life, like a beloved childhood video game or Garfield, and turning it into a severely screwed up version of itself. It's uniquely upsetting because no one sees it coming. But in reading some of your replies to that video and some of your other examples of things that internet people have been making to freak out the normies, I quickly realized how common fear of authority was as a theme in many of these works as well. Keeping on the topic of video games, one thing that a number of you brought to my attention was this current fad of making phony anti-piracy screens, which is such a wonderful example of what I'm talking about. Basically, people have taken to posting these videos on YouTube that look like footage of some normal game being played as usual, but then we abruptly cut to a screen informing us that the software being played is actually pirated. Sometimes the screens feature grotesque pictures, but the most effective ones, in my opinion, are the ones that engage in a kind of over-the-top authoritarian response to news of this crime, as in this classic one from the DS game Mario Party.
911, what's your emergency?
Now, pirating media is basically the most middle-class crime you could possibly imagine. It is very common, but also quite difficult to enforce, which means that companies often have to attempt to discourage it simply by propagandizing the public with guilt and shame. As we can see here in this very iconic early 2000s public service announcement from the Motion Picture Association of America that was once often shown in movie theaters and at the beginning of DVDs. But what I like about that Mario video in particular is how it starts with just a blunt appeal to guilt with this stern, scolding message, but then goes way further with the game literally turning against you and forcing you to interact with a literal, real-world authority figure in a context where your guilt cannot be denied.
911, what's your emergency?
You have no choice but to explicitly confess that you are not, in fact, a respectable member of bourgeois consumer society, but rather a crude and vulgar criminal. Which is exactly the sort of collapse of reputation and dignity middle-class life is heavily based around avoiding. In other words, true middle-class horror. This notion of being forced into an unwilling encounter with authority is, of course, a very common sort of middle-class nightmare. Not just when you've done something wrong, but perhaps especially when you haven't. We even have a whole term, Kafka-esque, to refer to the unique terror that comes from being trapped in a stressful bureaucratic process that is seemingly beyond comprehension. The term comes from the 20th century Czech writer Franz Kafka, who wrote a lot of stories and novels that dealt with these sorts of psychological themes. Most notably, The Trial, which tells the tale of an innocent middle-class guy, a bank teller, who is forced to endure a year of hell dealing with extremely demanding and judgmental lawyers and court procedures despite having no clue what crime he's even being accused of in the first place.
Can there be any doubt that behind my arrest, a vast organization is at work? An establishment which contains a retinue of civil servants, officers, police, and others, perhaps even hangmen.
The computer game The Stanley Parable is a great Kafka-esque horror story for the modern age. You play as a model office worker named Stanley, who shows up to work one day only to find that all of his coworkers have vanished. A bossy narrator guides you as you attempt to figure out what's going on, but the game only proceeds to become more ambiguous and confusing, and the narrator more unhinged, and you seem destined to just keep wandering this soulless middle-class workplace forever, never getting to any sort of firm conclusion about the reality of Stanley's world.
These rooms were starting to look pretty familiar. Were they simply repeating? No, Stanley said to himself, this is all too strange. This can't be real.
Which in turn is often quite explicitly presented as a metaphor for the broader existential dread that modern white-collar workers feel. This idea that for all of their obedience and loyalty to their jobs, their lives are ultimately subordinate to the whims of some cruel and arbitrary higher power.
Stanley was so bad at following directions, it's incredible he wasn't fired years ago.
The idea that authorities could be maddeningly vague in what they want from us is the subject from which another popular realm of middle-class horror derives, the creepy news alert. So, like I said at the beginning of this video, the reason why governments or TV networks sometimes broadcast breaking news in a very stark and unsettling way is because it grabs people's attention and conveys a level of no-nonsense seriousness. Some creators, in turn, have had some morbid fun imagining how governments of the past or present might choose to broadcast some of the most serious news of all. The small YouTube channel Harvester, for instance, has made some pretty cool emergency warning videos for various theoretical situations, such as this one, warning of a nuclear attack on Great Britain.
Information of a possible nuclear strike against this country has been received. The current threat level is critical, meaning an attack is imminent. We can now confirm the trajectories of the missiles. They are London, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Glasgow and Bristol. If you are in or within a 10-mile radius of these cities, evacuate now. Failure to do so will result in certain death.
There is also a very good album called The Midnight Sector by the electronic band Phantom West that is basically just this very long, creepy, and increasingly distorted, automated emergency news broadcast describing the unfolding end of the world due to an overlapping environmental catastrophe and nuclear war.
Reported incidents include downed lines in the Columbia River Valley and the Sacramento River Delta. Downed lines in these locations, as well as local thunderstorm activity in the western Sierra, have caused widespread wildfires. For Western U.S. information regarding the wildfires, stay tuned to this channel or channel 8WD for hourly updates.
I really love that album because as the end of the world edges closer, the information in the broadcasts becomes harder and harder to understand because the decaying state of the planet is interfering with the broadcast quality.
It is unknown at this time if the deployed weapons comprise the complete arsenal available to the two nations. In Britain, continuity of government procedures have been put in place. The ambulance of most Hall and Parliament staff to Hawthorne in Wiltshire to avoid the ongoing unrest in central London. The BBC has not been able to maintain contact with any members of the Defence Ministry since closing its own London facilities. Stay tuned to BBC.
So it creates this unsettling effect where your diligent efforts to listen closely to the official news so you know what to do becomes pointless. You are left to fend for yourself at precisely the moment where you need the most instruction. Helplessness of this sort is of course a theme that is often used by Hollywood in apocalyptic horror, in which middle-class heroes suddenly have to fend for themselves in a society stripped of the rule of law. The most famous modern example would probably be The Purge.
Commencing at the siren, any and all crime, including murder, will be legal for 12 continuous hours. Police, fire, and emergency medical services will be unavailable until tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. when the purge concludes. May God be with you all.
I think this fear of being abandoned by authority is why a lot of us continue to be fascinated by the so-called number stations as well. You know, these shortwave radio stations that do nothing but endlessly broadcast strings of numbers for some reason.
2, 2, 5, 1. 2, 1, 1, 0.
They sound so official, and anyone can listen, but what are we supposed to do with this information? As I said in my first video, the anxiety of a higher power like the government conspiring in secret is a very particularly middle-class sort of fear, in part because we are so used to assuming that all officialdom in our society works for our benefit and our convenience, or at the very least is able to be understood by us. Then there are those who play with the idea of creepy official broadcasts in a more surrealist way. Take the YouTube channel Local 58, for instance, by the writer and artist Christopher Straub. He makes videos featuring warning messages from a fictional TV station that don't really make a lot of sense, but are instead just a kind of bizarre and disturbing poetry that fully exploits the inherently unsettling nature of the medium. Chris calls this sort of thing analog horror, which gets into this idea that old and outdated technology, in this case video footage from an old-fashioned CRT television, is uniquely scary in its own right. I would argue that this in part comes from a certain middle-class obsession with always having the latest and greatest thing, which can kind of make us hate and fear devices or media which are old or primitive. Old media can also remind us of the traumas of history. The idea that old-fashioned technology can be a harbinger of old-fashioned problems, like, say, nuclear war. You could say that the siren head monster, which is this sort of new internet folklore thing, would be a super literal example of this. You have a monster with an old-fashioned doomsday siren for a head, and he tromps around blaring his old-fashioned siren noises, thereby combining the traditional biological horror of a grotesque creature with the analog horror of primitive technology, as well as the authoritarian horror of an emergency broadcast. They've been dreaming up some buddies for Siren Head lately, with one of them being Test Pattern Head, which which I think is pretty inspired. Test patterns being another thing I remember finding quite unnerving as a child. For those of you who are too young to remember, there was a time in which TV stations did not air content 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In the old days, many TV stations actually used to shut down in the evening and only resume programming the following morning. This is how I was introduced to the concept of test patterns as a kid in the 1980s. Sometimes I would get up too early and turn on the TV, but all I would get is this ominous hum and these garish colors. To this day, you often see the test pattern used as a kind of go-to symbol for a kind of disturbing media death, evoking the unnerving thought that all of the round-the-clock broadcasts that supply the middle class with their precious non-stop information and entertainment have the capacity to die like anything else. On that note, I have noticed that a lot of younger people have become quite fascinated with the archival footage of the exact moment that TV stations shut off for the night. It can be kind of creepy to watch for the same reason. And only adding to the creepiness factor is the fact that TV stations often use their shut-off as an opportunity to be patriotic, playing the national anthem alongside uplifting nationalistic imagery before fading into the test pattern. But this often makes the tradition just seem all the more grim, like you're watching the president's funeral or something. An even rarer and more extreme example of this is when a TV station goes out of business and thus at some point will have to air its final ever broadcast before shutting down permanently. When a station goes off the air in this fashion, they usually just show a very brief message in the middle of the night before going black. There is rarely much fanfare, but it can still be a little creepy to see, just because it is weird to see a TV station just go away like this. In 2021, the low-budget kids network Cubo went off the air for good, and what exactly they broadcasted in their final moments on the air became a subject of great gossip and speculation. Eventually, this bizarre clip surfaced in which the end of an episode of Super Geek Heroes cuts to a dark screen containing a bunch of Cubo characters and a frantic message begging for viewers to call in and donate $2,500 before midnight. And as the timer counts down, the heads of the characters are literally blown off by an unseen shotgun. And after everyone is shot and the clock gongs midnight, we get a bitter and judgmental message from the network blaming the selfish viewers for killing the station. We expected better from our viewers, and they have failed us. This is your fault. Thanks for nothing. Now obviously this footage is fake, and the very fine YouTuber Wavy Websurf did a good video the other day deconstructing it in more detail. But independent of the cheap gore, I find the video fascinating in the way that it once again derives much of its creepiness from its ability to guilt trip its audience with the blunt assertion of some disappointed authority. What a shameful thing you have done. Much like the pirated screens we saw earlier, this strikes me as something that is very upsetting to middle-class children in particular, given that kids of this sort are usually so eager to please at this age. To instead be blamed by some stern and confusing adult authority for the death of something you love, well, it's basically Kafka for children. Ted Turner, the founder of CNN, which was one of the first 24/7 TV channels, once famously declared that his station would only shut off once the world ends. And a few years ago, it was leaked that CNN actually had a sign-off video to be played when the world ended. It was just a bleak video of a band playing Nearer My God to Thee, which is a popular funeral hymn, followed by a fade to black. Man, that is grim, hey? I don't know if CNN is still the most trusted name in news like they used to be, but even then it is hard to imagine a more authoritative announcement that your life is over than seeing it broadcast on CNN. This is quite literally intended to be a tape that is the last thing you see before you die. Now, the reason why I frame all of this stuff as being specifically middle-class horror is because I think it's important for us to understand, and indeed this is becoming an increasingly big theme of my channel overall, the degree that modern American society is defined by the prevalence of a certain kind of lifestyle, a consumerist lifestyle of generally high material comfort, but also one defined by a bundle of values and social expectations of what life is supposed to be like and how a properly ordered world should work. I personally think it is hard to have much insight into the reasons for the popularity of certain forms of art or horror or humor or most other realms of American culture without first having a solid grasp on the lifestyle and mindset of the middle class. And while I feel like we have pretty much played out internet horror at this point, I would be curious to know if there are any other realms of American cultural life you would like to see me do a similar analytic take on. Let me know in the comments. Do not forget to check out Ground News, and I will see you all next week.